attention to that man behind the curtain. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
For the guy at the bottom of the pyramid, it's about money. For the guy at the top, it's about control. Control of the real money, natural resources. When all we have left is the earth, what good will your $100 bill do you? Can it make water fall from the heavens? Can it make food spring forth from the earth? Can it fill your lungs with life-giving oxygen? They've given us food, monopoly money to play with, and we will kill one another in the street for it. While behind the scenes, they are taking control of the life resources, air, land, food, and water. It's not about money, it's about control.
But there's a reason. There's a reason. There's a reason for this, and it's the same reason that it will never, ever, ever be fixed. It's never going to get any better. Don't look for it. Because the owners of this country don't want that. I'm talking about the real owners now. The real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets. And they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. And you know something? They'll get it. They'll get it all from you sooner or later because they own this fucking place. It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
Dick Cheney told us after 9/11 this was going to be a war that was not going to end in our lifetimes. It is a sequential war to control the last remaining oil reserves on the planet.
The future security of the United States depends upon the President's program for transforming the Middle East, and Iraq is the first step in doing so.
Now with agribusiness, you drive an oil-powered machine to plow, you drive an oil-powered machine to plant, then you fertilize it with natural gas, then you irrigate it with water that's pumped by electric pumps where the electricity comes from burning natural gas or oil in most cases. Then you spray it with oil pesticides, then you harvest it with an oil-powered vehicle, and the bottom line is that we eat 10 calories of hydrocarbon energy for every calorie of food consumed on the planet.
All around the world, oil consumption is exploding. New gigantic markets, such as those in India and China, have opened up to modern consumerism and have driven the global need for oil through the roof.
China, with its red-hot economy, just passed Japan as the second largest importer of oil on the planet. China's economy has had like a 10% growth rate. It's on fire. The Chinese people are demanding more computers, automobiles. Chinese auto sales up 100% in 1 year. GM sales in China up 300% in 1 year. That's what keeps the American economy going.
La superpuissance consomme.
The United States, the only superpower, uses 20 million barrels of oil every day, and it is estimated that it will need 25 million barrels per day around 2020. While its own reserves are dwindling, the U.S. only produces 5 to 6 million barrels per day and imports almost 3/4 of the oil it needs.
Satellite imaging applied to oil exploration has confirmed a stark reality. With increasing consumption and diminishing reserves, the world is rapidly running out of oil. At the current rate of production, the West will be first to hit the zero mark by 2010. At this point, both the United States and Europe will depend entirely on outside sources for their oil. Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, while self-sufficient today, are next and due to run out by 2013. With its exploding oil consumption, Asia will run dry in 2018. The reality, however, is that major conflicts are likely to erupt before any of these players actually runs out of oil.
Is it conceivable that the United States, that dominates the world with its technology, its economy, its military, its space programs, is it conceivable that such a power would let itself fall at the mercy of the outside world for an energy source indispensable to its existence? This is impossible.
Right after the Bush administration took office, Vice President Cheney took over and instituted what was called the National Energy Policy Development Group, or NEPDG. Most people just call it the Energy Task Force, the Vice President's Energy Task Force. It operated in secret from January of 2001 until May of 2001. 7 pages of records were finally released out of who knows how many thousands of pages. And what those showed was, they were maps of all the oil fields in Iraq, the oil fields in the United Arab Emirates, which would be, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Oman, all the Emirates, and all the maps of the oil fields in Saudi Arabia, along with lists of all the countries and the companies that had oil development contracts in that region. That's very telling.
Seeking any valid or fabricated evidence against Saddam Hussein, the Bush administration allies with an internationally wanted felon, the self-proclaimed Iraqi opposition leader Ahmed Chalabi.
Ahmed was a key source of a lot of these stories, that Saddam Hussein had vast quantities of undetermined weapons of mass destruction that he was going to either use directly against U.S. interests or give to terrorists who would do the same thing.
In June of 2004, accused this time of counterfeiting Iraqi money, Ahmed Chalabi runs again from justice. He flees from Iraq, where he had been appointed by the Bush administration to the so-called Iraqi Governing Council. For President Bush, this comes as the latest embarrassment surrounding the war in Iraq.
We're not too worried about dictators as long as they're on our side, do what we tell them. Democracy is not the reason we went in there. The main reason is geostrategic regional dominance, which is the one that relates to energy supplies. Another reason for this invasion occupation at the time that we did it had to do with the pressure to lift sanctions. There was a huge pressure building to lift sanctions on Iraq. Had sanctions been lifted or partially lifted, Iraq could have been filled with Europeans, Russians, Chinese, Japanese, all kinds of folks, no Americans or British folk, but we and the UK had been bombing Iraq for 12 years. Had sanctions been lifted with Saddam Hussein still in charge, we would have gotten no contracts and no opportunities to invest in Iraq. But furthermore, we would have lost the ability to attack Iraq at any time because Iraq would have been filled with foreigners. And then the other aspect to me is a smaller one, but it has to do with Saddam Hussein's decision in November of 2000 to switch to the euro for all of his oil for food exports. He had been on the dollar for decades, and he decided to switch to the euro. Had he gone into full production of his oil capability, and had he continued to trade oil on the euro and not the dollar, this would have actually had a financial impact on the United States, in that central banks around the world would be more favorable towards the euro and less to the dollar. We had been dissatisfied, as were the Saudis, with our bases in Saudi Arabia. Huge pressure to move out of Saudi Arabia. Where would we move to? We had saturated Kuwait with our bases. The base we have in Qatar is too far south. Certainly Iran is not an option. Turkey was becoming problematic because they have democracy in Turkey, and they actually have to consent to our presence there. So we're looking for a new place to put bases, which will allow us to exercise political, some economic, and certainly military power in the region.
Iraq was selected. It met the required conditions. First condition is it was understood that it was completely defenseless. You don't attack a country if it can defend itself. Secondly, it was important because it has the second largest oil reserves in the world, and it's right at the heart of the main oil-producing region of the world. So establishing a client state in Iraq, presumably with military bases, would put the United States in an even stronger position than before.
Additionally, with U.S. forces all around the Gulf and controlling one of the world's largest oil exporters, the U.S. would have strategic control over Persian Gulf oil. And that's power. In that position, the U.S. can cut off oil to anyone it wants by stopping ships from going out of the Persian Gulf and creating an embargo. So I think it's much more oil for power than it is oil for money.
But in Iraq, radiation comes in other forms as well. Like during the 1991 Gulf War and the war in Kosovo, depleted uranium rounds were used again by the U.S. military, this time including the center of Baghdad. They lie around for anyone to see and touch. The Geiger counter will give a reading of between 5 and 15 pulses per minute in a typical environment. This depleted uranium round will trigger 10,000 pulses in about 40 seconds. This type of ammunition is radioactive because it is made of nuclear waste referred to as uranium-238 or depleted uranium. This material is left over from the processing of uranium-234 used for atomic bombs and uranium-235 used in nuclear power plants. Long considered toxic garbage, it found an extremely controversial application in the making of cheap, high-perforation shells. Uranium-238 remains radioactive for 4.5 billion years, and its toxicity reveals itself as soon as particles are inhaled or ingested. Cancer and birth defects are the most common side effects.
The United States military forces used 320 tons of depleted uranium in the first Gulf War in 1991. The difference between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War is very significant, and that is that in the second war we have seen a lot more depleted uranium use in populated areas, in urban centers.
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
In a reciprocal fashion, the U.S. government is using this situation as an excuse to base troops abroad in the vicinity of oil resources, 3/4 of which happen to be located in Muslim countries.
We now have permanent bases in Iraq. We've had them in Kuwait for a while. We have permanent bases in Afghanistan. We are building permanent bases in Uzbekistan. We actually have 4 bases in Georgia. So if you draw a map that connects the dots between all of the bases that we have done since the Cold War ended, what you see is American military hegemony covering 90% of the globe's energy resources in terms of gas and in terms of oil.
Washington, however, appears to recognize the potential for conflicts with the pipeline that would ultimately serve China's 1.5 billion consumers as well. Indeed, U.S. oil companies are now favoring a western route through the sparsely populated regions of Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and eastern Turkey towards the Mediterranean Sea, and eventually Europe and the United States. For this reason, the U.S. military is not even trying to control the Afghan warlords, whose persistent violence would hamper the pipeline's construction. In addition, continued unrest justifies a large U.S. military presence in Afghanistan that will remain as a deterrent to any other foreign intrusion into the region. Fighting terrorism is clearly not the reason for such a large deployment of troops, as clandestine terrorist cells are better fought by undercover agents and special forces. Is it a coincidence if massive U.S. military positioning happens to take place in Central Asia, the Persian Gulf, and other oil-rich regions of the world? Is fighting terrorism the real motive? Or is Washington more interested in grabbing whatever oil reserves are left, fueling terrorism and war as a result?
But the table is tilted, folks. The game is rigged. And nobody seems to notice. Nobody seems to care.